It may be that the electric vehicle revolution is inevitable and it's just a question of how long it takes. But in the meantime, we seem to be living in the middle of a case study about what can go wrong when you try to do a massive change at an accelerated pace. So let's start where the revolution is at its height: China. As we know, China has dived into EVs big time, part of its determination to make the clean tech revolution a key part of its economic growth. And at first glance, China's homegrown EV market is absolutely booming. So here's one version of the story that supports that contention. Chinese EV manufacturers such as NIO, Zeekr, Xiaomi and Xpeng have all broken their own sales records over recent months. According to the Business Insider website, Xpeng delivered 24,000 vehicles last month. Xiaomi sold over 100,000 of its SU7 model so far this year. Zeekr delivered a record 55,000 vehicles over the last quarter, up 50% on last year. NIO delivered 61,800 vehicles over the last quarter. And of course, we know that they're all being successful because they're producing EVs cheaper than the West can and threatening to flood the global market with them, spurring the United States and Europe to slap tariffs on them to desperately protect their own manufacturers. So that's one version. The other version, based on exactly the same reality, is that all these companies are losing money hand over fist. NIO may have delivered a record number of cars in the last quarter, but it's also reported widening losses in its Q3 earnings report, where it disclosed a net loss of 5 billion yuan, that's $700 million. Zeekr recorded a 1.14 billion yuan loss last year, that's $157 million. So why, if they're selling so many vehicles, are they bleeding cash? Principally because of the savage price war that's been ongoing. Turns out that even Chinese manufacturers can't really make EVs that cheaply. Now, this isn't an unusual situation for an emerging marketplace where the stakes are so high. What you're seeing is companies seeking to survive the initial rationalization to be one of the handful left standing once the carnage has been completed. So, from 300 Chinese EV startups, only 100 of them survived the first decade. Now there are fewer than 50 that still exist, only 40 of which are actually currently selling cars. The chief executive of Xpeng, He Jianpeng, told the Straits Times that he believed there would only be 7 of the companies still around by the end of the next decade. The ones that are left will be the ones that become profitable because they get to dominate an actually viable slice of an extremely large pie. One Chinese company, however, is not suffering these problems. It has already broken through that barrier. You probably know the name already. It's BYD, the company that has beaten Tesla into second place for EVs globally. BYD stands for Build Your Dreams, and they seem to have done just that. BYD built 3 million EVs in 2023 compared to Tesla's 1.8 million. It may actually overtake Ford for global vehicle sales in total for 2024. They are neck and neck at around 3.3 million for the first 3 quarters of the year. BYD's net profit rose for the previous quarter to 11.6 billion yuan, around $1.6 billion. It's growing in China, while Tesla's sales have been sliding there. According to analysts, BYD has benefited from having a manufacturing approach of making almost every component in-house, enabling it to keep costs low. It can control, therefore, the production of batteries and the all-important semiconductor chips. It also has enough scale that it can push external suppliers to reduce prices. So it recently demanded a 10% reduction predicting that the price war would intensify in 2025 and wanting to get ahead of that. It also has a strong hybrid lineup, so it's done well with recent trends that have boosted those what you might describe as halfway products. BYD is also becoming one of the drivers of innovation in the sector. For example, it will be launching a next generation battery for its vehicles, the so-called Blade battery, which promises increased range performance and longer lifespan. Clearly, when the market consolidates, BYD will have ridden the wave to become one of the key global operators. The question is, can Western companies deal with the speed of change? It's arguably been easier, although none of this is easy, for startups like Tesla and BYD to grow and become dominant than it has been for existing major companies to transform their operations. Signs of how that's going might be taken from the bankruptcy last week of Europe's big hope, battery champion Northvolt. It's founded in Sweden in 2016, Northvolt promised to bring the all-important battery manufacturing back home from the Asian company's stranglehold. The Financial Times recalled that it was going to use the Nordic region's abundant and cheap green energy to challenge the likes of BYD to help Europe's auto industry to transform and succeed. By 2022, it had $55 billion in customer orders. And it got drunk on its own hubris, its plans for expansion across the world leading to domination. And while it was doing all that, it was singularly failing, reportedly, to sort out production in its home base, which produced less than 1% of the batteries that its capacity should have meant that it was able to produce there. The remote location of the plant meant that they struggled to attract good people to work there being no near neighbours to poach employees from. Former and current employees told the Financial Times that poor safety standards, unnecessary spending and widespread mismanagement all came together to bring the show down. Northvolt was left looking for emergency funding, and the Swedish government quickly ruled out state support. This stuff is hard, it turns out. It's easy to indulge survivor bias in how you look at this, looking at the BYDs and the Teslas and assuming that what they did must be easily reproducible. Northvolt now has new leadership. It hopes to raise extra financing and exit bankruptcy, but that hasn't yet stopped Asian producers of batteries celebrating their good fortune. Meanwhile, governments that set forcing targets to push for transition to electric vehicles are discovering that such policies create unintended consequences. In the United Kingdom, what the right-wing media are calling Labour's net zero plans, but which was actually a policy brought in by the previous Conservative government, have provoked a major pushback in the wake of Vauxhall announcing the closure of a plant in Luton with the loss of over 1,000 jobs. The company said that this was in part due to the EV target rules of the government. The government of Rishi Sunak announced last year that car manufacturers would be required to have 80% of new cars, 70% of new vans to be zero emissions by 2030, increasing to 100% by 2035. And the companies would be fined for failing to reach that threshold. This always seemed an odd mechanism because ultimately the companies are not really in control of customer demand. I mean, yes, if incentivized, they can bring their best marketing to bear, they can cut prices, all of those things. But ultimately, if you're trying to push faster than the customer wants to go, then that really leaves you on a hiding to nothing. Well, it's left car makers staring at a potential £2 billion in fines, even though they've been spending twice that on discounts to try to make the cars more attractive to buyers. Last week, the government met with company executives to puzzle it out, and they subsequently announced that there would be a consultation on the zero emissions mandate to give the car industry, quote, clarity. Seasoned Westminster watchers will recognise the slow grinding gears of an imminent U-turn. Not all companies want the mandate abandoned. Challenger companies such as Octopus Electric Vehicles see it as caving to the weaknesses of the laggard companies that they want to profit at the expense of. But if those laggard companies are the ones currently employing thousands of workers, their problems are going to be taken seriously by the government. One of their other problems is when you bring in new technology at a rapid pace. The teething problems can turn into a big scale headache. Jaguar has announced that it's buying back one of its EV models from all of its US owners due to the risk of fires. Owners had been given the not wholly reassuring advice to only charge the batteries up to 80% and to park them outside. Just in case it might burst into flames. Sort of like buying a new family dog and being told, yeah, it might be best to leave the muzzle on whenever it's in a room with children. Very reassuring. Still, at least it diverted attention from its recent rebranding exercise, which caused more than a few commentators to burst into flames themselves on viewing it, by all accounts. The company's rebrand is meant to position it as an electric-only competitor with the likes of Porsche and Bentley. It will be launching its new line of cars next week, and maybe it will become known as a marketing genius that defied the naysayers and mopped up the electric car buyers who now turn up their nose at buying anything associated with Elon Musk. It may also be another case study filed under the derisive label these days of go woke, go broke. Only time will tell. In the meantime, expect this to continue to be an extremely messy market, not least when the new President Donald Trump arrives in the White House. By all accounts, the transition will continue, regardless of presidential preferences, but the details will certainly change. You cannot, though, make such a big shift without it being messy, without some companies failing the test, new challenges emerging, false starts, setbacks, embarrassments. Well, it'll give us something to talk about, if nothing else.